Good morning, this is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Last week we did an introduction to the book of Job, which likely was the first book of the Bible completed, and today we're going to begin in Job 1. The book of Job is about suffering. We can see that throughout the book, and we also need to continue to assess the relationship between sin and suffering. Suffering on this earth began at the Garden of Eden when we began to sin. And it will continue until we're no longer on this earth and we're in heaven with the Lord. That gives us a hope that suffering will end. And remember that hope is not just a wish to a believer, but it's our confident expectation of what God has promised. And it's based on the strength of that hope is God's faithfulness, all right? That's important to know. So Job 1 begins with Job's resume. And it's not a title, but it's more a reflection of his character. So let's begin in Job 1, first three verses in the New American Standard Bible. It says this: "There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions also were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. And that man was the greatest of all the men of the East." So we see, in addition to Job's character, we see reference to his family. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And then we see vast amounts of livestock, right? And with that livestock, in an agrarian economy like Job lived in, it tells us of Job's wealth. But notice that God calls attention to Job's righteousness rather than to his wealth. I think that's important. But verse 3 says he was the greatest of all the men of the East. That's the Hebrew word gadol. And gadol signifies, it has to do something with value, which could be wealth, right? It's also attributed to Abraham in Genesis 24:15, I believe, 24:35. Job was a wealthy man, but remember, in God's telling, the emphasis is on his righteousness. The story continues. We hear about something that Job's children, the 10 children, did regularly. They had birthday feasts where they all met together in one home. And this wasn't just a meal. It was a gathering that could last for days, and they celebrated together. So it points to a close-knit family, but at the same time, one thing to notice that Job's not in attendance, and Job's wife also is not in attendance. But whenever they gathered together for these birthday feasts, and we can't just say there were 10 of them, because it could be that there was a set of twins, or that some of them were born near the same birth date, and they gathered together to celebrate that. We don't know how many feasts there were, but we know that there were multiple in the year. And we also can see Job's part in the celebration. And Job's part in the celebration as a godly man was that Job would perform a burnt offering, a sacrifice, and it was really in case they had cursed God in their hearts. Job 1:5 says this in the New American Standard Bible: "When the days of feasting had completed their cycle, Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, 'Perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts.' Thus Job did continually." So it's interesting that this appears to be before God instituted the sacrificial system. Right? Job doesn't know the specifics of any sin that has occurred, but he's performing these burnt offerings based on what might have happened. And it appears to be that Job is operating as the high priest of his family. All right? He's giving burnt offerings to cover sin, mentioning they may have cursed God in their hearts. The word consecrate used here in Hebrew is the same as the word in Hebrew used for sanctify or to be holy. And holiness as a man is unobtainable without a process that God gives us. So let's go into just a short background of the sacrificial system. Once again, we've talked about this a little before, but there can be no forgiveness of sin apart from the spilling of innocent blood. And the first time that we see an example of this is when Adam and Eve sin and God covers them with skin. So basically, for that skin, an animal skin, to be made for them, an animal had to die. So that was the first death in the Bible. So that's the first example of the spilling of innocent blood to cover sin. We can also see in Genesis 8, Noah performed a burnt offering after the ark found land. So before life began on this new earth, there was a burnt offering. Genesis 22, God called Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And then at the last moment, he substituted this unblemished male lamb to be sacrificed in the place of Isaac. Once again, the spilling of innocent blood to cover sin. Then we can see the same occur with the Passover lamb in Exodus 22. And it's not until Exodus 27, when God gives the Ten Commandments, that we can see instructions about creating the tabernacle. And that included 7 articles of furniture for the tabernacle. One of those was the brazen altar, the bronze altar. And the process there was given for how to cover the sin of the people. So if Job already was operating in this manner, it points to before the sacrificial system was instituted through God giving the commandments. If it happened before that time, it points to a close personal relationship between God and Job, and likely a personal revelation of performing a sacrifice, a burnt offering. It all points forward, remember now, to the cross, when the Lamb of God died for the sins of the world. All the sins of the world were placed on the shoulders of Jesus, and when Jesus died at Calvary, all these examples in the Old Testament pointed forward to that event when, through the spilling of innocent blood, there would be forgiveness of sin. So Job's burnt offering was not just meant to cover overt sin, but also sinful intent. All right? It said that they might have cursed God in their hearts. Also notice that Job did not perform a sacrifice, at least at that time, for himself or for his wife. I think that's interesting that he was representing his children here. And so what we see is we don't see a judgmental father, but we see a loving father trying to help his children. All right? There's an interesting verse in Psalm 24, 1 through 6 in the New American Standard Bible says this: "The earth is the Lord's and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. Who may ascend into the hill of the Lord, and who may stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not lifted up his soul to falsehood, and has not sworn deceitfully. He shall receive a blessing from the Lord, and righteousness from the God of his salvation. This is the generation of those who seek him, who seek your face, even Jacob." So we see a differentiation here between clean hands and a pure heart. And if you think about it, clean hands designate action. With our hands, we do things, right? So if your hands are clean, you're not physically getting involved in sin. And then a pure heart shows motive, right? So we can see the difference between the two. And Jesus, remember, told us that if we commit adultery in our hearts, it's the same as committing adultery. So sin can be done in action, and it also can be done in motive. If our motives aren't right, it's still sin. But here we see different things. Now, also think of something else. It's easy to disguise our motives, but we can see what someone does with their hands. People around you, if you're in sin, they're gonna catch you. They're gonna see it if you're doing it outright. But if in your heart, sometimes you can fool people. We can hide those motives. And it reminds me of that definition of the word character. Character is often described as who you are when no one is looking, right? And that's kind of what our motive is. Our motives, our pure hearts would be, if we're clean inside, then it's because we have character, okay? Job wanted to make sure that while they were celebrating, that they didn't curse God in their heart. So maybe he's thinking what's going on is it's just a drunken party, and if they're drunk, they're going to make that sin a little bit easier. Okay, it sounds like his fatherly love rather than his judgment. Job does this continually, right? Not just once. So each one of these celebrations, this is part of what Job does for his children. And it demonstrates that the focus of Job's life was God. I think that's pretty important, of that close personal relationship with Jesus Christ, right? So with all these glowing accolades about Job, that he was upright, he was righteous, does that mean he was sinless? And it's like, no, because we know from Romans there's no one righteous, no, not one. And there was no man without sin. So Job was not sinless, but he was as righteous as a man that lived on the earth at the time. So then the setting changes to heaven. And this is really interesting, what happens here. So Satan and his demons are at the throne of God. And we need a little background here, because first time we can see in Genesis 3 that Satan is no longer there. But at one time, Satan was the covering cherub. So he was basically the highest ranking angel. And we can see in two different chapters, Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, we can see information about the fall of Satan. So Satan basically got filled with pride, and part of it, he was beautiful. Some of it was he was proud of his own beauty, but he began to rebel against God. And in this rebellion, I think it's in Revelation 12:4, it points to a third of the angels had also fallen from heaven. So the number of angels is innumerable, but we can also see that 1/3 of those angels rebelled against God and went with Satan, and that leaves 2/3 of the angels that continue to serve the Lord. So it sounds like, at least at one time, Satan was very beautiful, so we shouldn't be fooled by the Hollywood interpretation of Satan of being this ugly horned beast. It's possible that he draws people in by his beauty. Satan began to see himself as a created being. Even though he was a created being, he began to see himself just as powerful as the Creator. So let's look at one of those sections. In Isaiah 14, verses 12 through 15, in the New American Standard Bible, it says this: "How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the earth, you who have weakened the nations. But you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Nevertheless, you will be thrust down to Sheol, to the recesses of the pit." So we can see that Satan wanted to be like the Most High. It's interesting because it doesn't appear that he said he wanted to be greater than the Most High, so it seems that there's still some understanding within him that you can't be greater than the most powerful, the most all-knowing. But Satan is a created being. It's interesting that he would do battle with his Creator. The surprising part to me is, though he was cast away from heaven, he still had access to the throne of God. And again, it could be that God invited him. I don't know. It's just an interesting conversation. But God asks him, "Hey, Satan, what you been doing?" "Well, I've been walking around to and fro on the earth." And this is what he's been doing forever and ever. This is what Satan has done, and it shouldn't surprise us why he's so good at making people stumble, because it's well rehearsed. He's practiced this a whole lot. And it's also interesting that God is all-powerful. And if God has us in his hands, it's interesting to wonder why Satan would continue to attack us the way that he does. Because he can't take away our salvation, but what he can take away is he can take away our testimony. If Satan causes us to stumble in a really horrible way, it's likely that the people that we might have impacted by telling them about God's love and God's forgiveness aren't going to listen to us because of the sin that we've committed. But we see that Satan had a whole lot of pride here. And he must know the scriptures. And he also must know the end of the story by reading Revelation, what's going to happen. So it's kind of confusing. Is Satan just so incredulous, thinking that he can battle God and beat him and defeat him? Or do you think that he just knows that, well, it's going to happen, but for the time being, let's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Maybe that's the way he looks at it, of he's just going to continue to create dissension, try to stop more people from becoming saved until this is all over. Because God's not going to let go of us. But this conversation between God and Satan is kind of difficult to fathom, because, God offers up Job. I just think that's interesting. Have you considered my good servant Job, who is the most righteous man? And it's like, you almost think that if you're walking closely with the Lord, personally, I don't know that I want God bragging on me to Satan. Hey, Gary's doing real well. Why don't you see if you can get him to stumble? And the honesty of it is that God knows the outcome of every situation. So if God is going to make a statement like that, we have to understand that he does have a purpose and a plan. There still was a purpose and plan in Job's life just as much as there is in each of our lives as well. That God had a purpose in bringing this up to Satan. But it's interesting just to think that, Satan, maybe he wouldn't have even considered Job until God brought this up. But for the hard part for me is it almost seems like a bit of a wager or a bet. And as a young believer, as a teenager, this really stumbled me, because how could the all-powerful God, if you know everything and you already know the outcome, why would you make a bet? And it almost seems like that. But the hard part really has to do with the other lives that are involved here. Job 1:10 says this in the New American Standard Bible. Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. So basically, Satan is in this argument or conversation with God, is saying, hey, you know what? I could make Job stumble, but the only reason that he's righteous and follows you the way that he has is because of the way that you've blessed him. It has nothing to do with strength. It has everything to do with just him being blessed, right? And God says, hey, go ahead, have your way with him. He said, you can attack his possessions. So then we see a new thing happen. There's a hedge of protection that's removed. And the fact that it's removed reminds us that there is one. So God has this ability, while Satan has been given dominion over the earth, God has the ability to protect us if he wants to protect us. Again, that shouldn't surprise us, because God is all powerful. So in this situation, God removed that hedge of protection, at least partially, so that Satan could attack Job's possessions. So Satan is unleashed in a way, and begins to attack Job's possessions. And a lot of people think it's a test. It's a test. And when I've studied test or trial in the Bible, it's interesting that because God knows everything, I wonder if there's really any point or purpose in us being tested, especially if you're looking at it to see how we will react. God knows how we will react. He already knows that. So in any test that occurs in the life of a believer, that test is made for a couple other reasons. Number one, it's a test because it reveals to us that God will do what he says he would do. He's going to show up. He's going to never leave us or forsake us. He's not going to break any of those promises. So it's our way of being able to test God to see that he is who he claims to be. And then the other side of it is we can see our breaking points. And when we see our breaking points, it also reveals to us areas of our life that we need to continue to work on. But it's not like God is testing us to see how we're going to react. He already knows how we're going to react. But God does have the ability to protect us. There's times when he's going to remove that so that we can continue to grow. So when God removes this hedge of protection from Job's possessions, you see what happens. And it's something that I struggled with for years. So you see that Job's servants are killed, Job's livestock are all killed, But most importantly, all 10 of Job's children are killed. And Satan attacks one of these birthday gatherings in a whirlwind, and all 10 of Job's children die in the process. It's interesting that later in the book of Job, God speaks to Job out of a whirlwind. So we can see that with Satan being given dominion over the earth, he can use the weather, and God also can use the weather. God created it. That shouldn't surprise us. Life is filled with suffering, but I can't imagine any pain greater than bearing a child. Even though we think it's, the way it should be is that a child should bury their parent, there's not a rule, even though it might be that it happens more often than not that the child buries the parent. But there can't be much more pain, more great, than when a parent has to bury their child. Job had to do this for 10, all his children. They were all gone. I remember my grandmother in her 90s, and near the time of her death, she still was reflecting on a child that she'd had, a daughter she'd had that died as an infant, and looking forward to seeing her in heaven, still sad about it. And for her to carry that for that many years, it just really shows how important our children are, the way we look at it. But when we look at this situation in Job, the lives that are involved is that God, in this interaction with Satan, allowing Satan to have his way, and kills these 10 children. And as a young believer, I had trouble understanding, why would God allow these 10 innocent people to die? But the truth is that, none of us are really innocent, are we? And again, it's having too much earthly perspective. We need to have more heavenly perspective. So Job's response ends chapter 1, and he says this in verses 20 through 22 of Job 1. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. That's amazing. That just is one of the most incredible things ever, that even in this, Job didn't sin. And I think it's pretty typical for us to blame God in the middle of a situation. We take credit when things are going well, and then we blame God or blame others when things aren't going well, instead of understanding that, God has the power to give and to take away, and he has complete knowledge, complete power. We need to trust him. It's back to that thing about trust. And also we should know and remember that Satan is a roaring lion, and he's out to destroy us. So we can see that even in this situation with Satan going to attack Job, he wanted to hit him where it hit the worst, where it hurt the worst. 1 Peter 5:8 in the New American Standard Bible says this: "Be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." He wants to eat us. He wants to devour us. So the setting changes back to heaven. And here's another conversation, and Satan makes the excuse that the reason that Job didn't sin was only because Satan wasn't allowed to attack him personally. It's only because he was only able to hurt his possessions and his children. So then God opens the door, and everything is fair game with one stipulation: Satan's not allowed to kill Job, but he can do anything else. This is hard to understand, but we have to remember, again, God's thoughts are not our thoughts, nor are his ways our ways. So then it goes to Job 2, and I want to focus on verses 7 through 9 in Job 2 in the New American Standard Bible, and it says this: "Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, and he took a potsherd to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. Then his wife said to him, 'Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die.'" Physical pain can be absolutely overwhelming. And if men were the ones that were responsible for giving birth, there is no family that would have more than one child. We kind of know how that works. Somehow women are able to forget that pain. I don't know that we can do that. It reminds me of growing up. I played a lot of basketball, and I had a lot of sprained ankles, and they were painful. And one was particularly bad, and I went into a skilled doctor that had worked on some NBA players, and he knew what he was doing. And he took an x-ray of my ankle, and he says, "This isn't a sprain, this is a break, and here's a hairline fracture." And he said, in fact, there are 9 other hairline fractures in this ankle. And then he did the other ankle, because I told him I'd had sprains there as well. And he found 11 hairline fractures in that. So all in all, I'd had 21 broken ankles when previously I'd only been diagnosed with sprains. Bottom line, though, is that it was painful. And there are times when I'd be watching sports on television or watching a movie, and I'd see someone jump, from a roof or rooftop or something like that and land hard. Or I'd see a guy on the basketball court, I'd see him roll his ankle, and I would just writhe in pain. It was amazing how much that pain, I remembered it so much that it almost made me physically sick. It hurt so bad. And this wasn't even when I was doing it. This was just remembering it. Pain is something that just can overwhelm you. One of the books I read in college was called The Body in Pain. And one of the biggest points of the book was that to someone that has never experienced pain, a pinprick seems like it's just something that's going to kill you. We can build a tolerance to it. But certainly in this situation, Job had a great chance to build a tolerance because he was enduring pain for a very lengthy period of time. Another part to consider is that when we're in this kind of pain, like Job's kind of pain, he didn't get any rest. So it actually gets worse because when we're exhausted, when we're not getting any rest, we don't make good decisions. So you can see as this progresses, to me, part of it is the enduring pain, but the fact that Job's not getting any rest is just exacerbating the issue. But Job lost everything, and now he's in immense pain. And it's kind of worth considering as well that you'd think that losing your 10 children would be worse than this physical pain. Job had lost it all, and he was in immense pain. But, at least the good side is he had a loving wife. So she gives him a 2-step process of how to deal with this. Number 1, curse God. Number 2, die. I can see the death part because when we're in a situation where we're enduring something, when we see the other side of it, it's a little bit easier to endure if we know there is another side of it. But for Job's case, either the pain was going to go away or he was going to die, but he didn't know how long that was going to take to get to that point. That was hard. But Job's not going to curse God and die. I always use that verse to teach people not to take verses out of context in the Bible and build a doctrine on it. What if you turn to this part of Job? It says, curse God and die. Well, that's really not the context of the verse, but this is his discouraging wife telling him what to do. And before we throw her under the bus entirely, we also have to some compassion for what she had endured. She just lost 10 children. A mother losing one child is overwhelming. A mother losing all 10 of her children, and especially it sounds like they were, grown and adults, and maybe they were grandchildren, who knows? But this is just an overwhelming thing. And so she's lost her hope, okay? But Job was in so much pain, he didn't get up to perform a burnt offering to cover the sin of his wife, trying to get him to curse God, because if she encouraged him to do that, it's likely that she had done the same thing. But if death involved getting away from her, he might have jumped at the chance, if been given the opportunity. But remember, she had lost all her children too. But this lasted all day and all night. He didn't have any end in sight. This is a hard thing. In Job's case, he'd lost it all, now was in physical pain to some degree, such a degree. And there was also something that was even worse gnawing at his soul. And that was the question, why? He'd followed God. He had been faithful to God. He was righteous. Why would this happen? Why would God allow this to happen? It was just starting to tear up his soul a little bit. And there's part where it's like trust in God, and then a moment later, questioning, why is this happening? Trust in God, questioning, trust in God, questioning. It goes back and forth. It's hard to stay firm on that straight course of just trusting in God when we start, again, walking by sight, not by faith. All right? God wasn't communicating with Job through this, we don't see. And Job, it doesn't sound like, was really communicating with him. So we see a separation between God and Job at this time, at least communication-wise. And then we see this reference to Job taking a potsherd and scraping the boils off his body. So a potsherd is a discarded piece of broken pottery. And it's just, the pot can't be used anymore. So there's these discarded pieces. So Job's using it for something. And I bet it was pretty sharp. But it makes me think that, we're vessels, right? And as sinners, we're broken vessels. So the fact is that most of the world would cast us away. But God, who is the master potter, he takes these broken pieces of pottery, which we are, and he heals them. He puts them back together, and then he fills them with living water. And it just I think that potsherd is really a great example of who we are. There was a prophetic verse at the cross of Psalm 22, where it says, "My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws, and you lay me at the dust of death." So Jesus felt like a discarded piece of pottery at the cross. And all of us sinners feel exactly the same way, that without God, we're not usable. He fills us with his living water after he heals us. So we finished today's study with Job 2:10, and it says this, "But he said to her, 'You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity?' In all this, Job did not sin with his lips." So Job remained righteous up to this point and faithful to God. He didn't blame God on this. He didn't even sin with his lips. And I just kind of wonder if this is referring to laying into his wife for being as discouraging as she was, sinning with his lips in that way. It could have been, cursing God with his lips, but it could also have been, curses laid out at her. And I can just see her response when he says this. "Are you calling me a fool?" It's like, well, if the shoe fits, take it off and beat yourself with it. That's really what you should do. But these are really important words. Should we only accept good from God, or should we accept everything that he allows? Right? Everything. Trusting that he has a purpose and a plan in our lives, and he only has perfect gifts for us. So if God allows this, there has to be a reason. Our trust in God is most important in difficult circumstances. And here is one of the most difficult circumstances. So Job has that opportunity, and it's not an opportunity most of us want, desire, or look for, that we want to be in a situation like this, but this opportunity to learn more about God and to draw closer to him. This is based on God's faithfulness, his promises, and what he's done for us in the past. There are lessons for every one of us to learn in every single situation. And one of those things we need to look at in this book is a lesson. It's not really as much about why we suffer, but it's more about the fact that we need to trust God in the midst of any situation, because God has power. Even though he's given dominion to Satan over this earth for a time, and Satan is out to devour us, God still has power. He's not going to let go of us. But we're still sinners, right? So even if we want to twist this a little bit in our brain and think that, do I deserve this? Did I earn it? Well, as sinners, we deserve death. We deserve a whole lot worse. And suffering is something that we can endure. It's one of those things that, I remember being at the Air Force Academy going through a program called SERI, and it was a survival program. And we spent the last week in a POW camp. And while we were in that camp, we were tortured and interrogated, and we didn't eat much. And it was a haze. But bottom line is that I still remember that I knew when it was going to be over. I knew exactly the moment when it would be over. And because of that, it was a lot easier to endure because you knew there was an end in sight. And in Job's circumstance, or let's say a prisoner of war, a real prisoner of war, instead of in a training situation, you don't know if or when there's an end in sight. For Job, all he knew was that death would be an end and he'd be with the Lord, but the rest of it in the process was pretty difficult, that he didn't know if there was going to be an end to this. And he was sad. He was sad and he felt kind of lonely. But we have to remember not to blame God. He didn't do it. All right, so next week, we have a change of setting and a change of actors. Job's friends are coming. They're coming for a visit, and we're going to go into that passage next week. All right? God bless you from Mooresville, North Carolina. Hope you're enjoying the study of Job. It's going to go on for a while. Take care.
Rushing wind blows through this temple, blowing out the dust within. Come and breathe your breath upon me. I've been born again. Holy Spirit, I surrender. Take me where you want to go. Plant me by your living waters. Plant me deep so I can grow. Jesus, you're the one who set my spirit free. Use me, Lord, glorify your holy name through me. Separate me from this world, Lord. Sanctify my life for you. Daily change me to your image. Help me bear good fruit. Every day you're drawing closer. Trials come to test my faith. But when all is said and done, Lord, you know it's been worth the wait. Jesus, you're the one who set my spirit free. Use me, Lord, glorify your holy name through me. Rushing wind blows through this temple, blowing out the dust within. Come and breathe your breath upon me. I've been born again.